Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt, to another episode on our usual. This is our original. This is what we started with. We started with exploring the Maseches, how the Maseches were learned throughout the ages, and their pirushim, their mefarshim, the achronim, the heintige, as we like to call it, which Eliezer Brodt pretty much stays away from. He stays away from Sfarim stores. As he's told us in the past, addicts have to know exactly where they're allowed to go, what their boundaries are. So it's not a place that he frequents, although everything's available online now, but mostly. So we are here to discuss Maseches Nazir. Maseches Nazir is beginning. We're recording this. It is Monday. Maseches Nazir is beginning on Wednesday. And Be'ezus Hashem, this should be exciting and enlightening for everybody as they begin the Masechta. I personally had the opportunity to learn Maseches Nazir in Yeshivas Brisk way back in the day. And Eliezer asked me what we used there. What was our go-to sefer? So I remember the Karanaira. I remember, obviously, what they called there the Taya and the Zayda, who is Rabbi Mishur Soloveitchik's father, Rabbi Soloveitchik, and his grandfather, Briskerov. We have Stentzlach, and perhaps Eliezer Brodt will fill us in a little bit more on some of the others from them may be used by other people who are learning Maseches Nazir. So, without further ado, Rabbi Brodt, how are you today?
Baruch Hashem.
Good to hear. So, we always pose the question, how was Maseches Nazir learned throughout the generations? So is there something right off the bat you want to tell us about Maseches Nazir? Before we even get to Rashi, which I think, I shouldn't say it, everyone, right? Everyone will agrees that it's not Rashi, it's a Mefarish. We don't know if it's everyone, we'll find out. But what is it to say before we get to Rashi?
So obviously the first question that we usually start out with is, did they learn it through the ages? Okay, that's the question. So the answer obviously will hopefully become throughout the episode, we'll be able to see what exactly happened. Looking into documents of libraries and collections that survived the Cairo Geniza, we do find that there were copies of Maseches Nazir, which would mean it was learned, but it doesn't necessarily mean it was learned widespread in yeshivas. Especially of note is that the Reshaiden Svarad, such as the Ramban, the Rashba, the Ritva, we don't have their Perushim. We don't know if they ever wrote. And later on, such as the Marshal, they didn't. And normally it's assumed that it's linked to Talmidim when they gave shir in it. So it seems it wasn't part of the curriculum even in the times of the Achrayim. But Rabbi Blau, Ramesha Bloi, which we will get to soon, he seems to make a list of some Mefarshim that did exist on Maseches Nazir that were lost. He actually discovers a few, which we will learn about. Anyway, the Gemara, because of this, that it wasn't really learned, it seems that this is the cause explained by many for the nusach of the Gemara, that the nusach is very hard, more than other Masechtos even. And for already, we discussed a little bit by Maseches Nedarim. Similar, there's Rabinovich in the Sefer Shari Teiris Bavel talks about the language of Maseches Nazir being Meshuna. There are other Makayers for this, but the text, because it's not learned as much, it didn't go through. Let's say even the Marshal and the Marsha that plays a role in the Gemara as we have it today. For this, we've mentioned in the past. Just to throw out there are some tools. One is the Dikduke Seifrim, which we actually spent an episode a little bit talking about by Reb Chaim Kanievsky last week. He did not get to write about Nazir, but someone in Chicago, Rav Hyman, I believe it is, in the 1940s, did transcribe the manuscript of Minchen for Maseches Nazir. It's found in some editions of the Dikduke Seifrim. Just recently, literally a few weeks ago, Mechon Talmud Yisraeli, who's also, we described a drap, is working to finish up Maseches Seder Nashim, which the Dikduke Seifrim did not do. They just released the first volume, which is on more than the first half of the Masechta. So this has many manuscripts, whatever the manuscript situation is with the Gemara, and it's very important, as we will see as we move on. And one last tool out there just to mention, like every Masechta, I try to find if there's junkies, if there's heintige junkies, if there's old junkies. So there is a person, it seems that he is a junkie on this Masechta. His name is Reb Asher Zonnenfeld. And from the year 2000 to 2014, he put out numerous works, which from Rishonim and Achrayim, which we'll get to throughout the course of the episode. Anyway, those are the very, very basic situation about the text of the Gemara, but we'll get more to it as we move along.
Excellent. Okay, so let's jump right in to Rashi, not Rashi, the Mefarish, and what could be found on the page itself. It's also a little bit different than the typical page, correct?
Yeah, yes. There's a little more action on the page. There's a little more action on the page than some other Masechtas. Okay, so first the question is it Rashi? So if you open up your Gemara and you look at Rashi if you look at the first Rabbi Akiva Eiger in his Gillion the first Gillion of Rabbi Akiva Eiger on the side of the standard Shas Vilna, he says, "B'sefer Shem Agdolim Lagoin Mareinu Chaim Yosef David Uzalai," brings down from the Yad Malachi, the Parish Nazir Einem Rashi. Okay, so this is very quoted already. Rabbi Yosef Engel in his Gilyoinei Hashas talks about this, and this is a well-known discussion. There's a little discussion in the famous Yedias of Rabbi Chanan in the Kaivetz Antarus, also dealing with if it's Rashi or not. Rabbi Chanan points to that we have some Rishonim that seem to have Rashi, such as the Meiri, which we're going to get to later on. One of the big discoveries for this Masechta was Rabbi Avram Nahar, and Rabbi Avram Nahar does quote Rashi. So the question in general has been asked: is did Rashi write on it and got lost, and how did that happen, or he never wrote about it? And is this Pirish really Rashi or not? Anyway, it seems way back when, I guess the early dating is the Beis Yosef brings from someone earlier than him, pointing out that the Pirish on the side is not Rashi. And it's called the Mefarish by the Beis Yosef, I believe. And for example, Magen Avram in Siman Taf Kuf Tzadik Aleph, Sif Katan Zayin, when he's talking about a Gemara in Adarim, he refers to V'chein, he brings down a Rivash, and after he says V'chein Kasam Mefarish ben Adarim. Okay. L'maisa, in looking in Tshuvas Svarim from Gedolei Olam in the Tkuf of the Beis Yosef, in Tshuvas that relate to Inyanim of Nazir, which we might touch on a drop soon, when they handle this Masechta and they talk about Rashi, they call it Rashi. So even though the Beis Yosef had an earlier Messiah, and I'm mentioning Magen Avram, who probably got it maybe even through the Beis Yosef. Anyway, fine. L'maisa, we have the Miri, we have a Avram Nahar. These two Rishonim bring down stuff from Rashi. Fast forward. The year 1800, there's a chibur called Bris Yaakov. He seemed to have had manuscripts, and he has pieces of Rashi. Okay, fast forward. I mentioned this junkie put out by Mechon Talmud Yisrael, by Mechon Harry Fischel, which we actually discussed about this Mechon in general in an episode with Ruchaim Kanievsky in season 1. So he has a 3-volume set called Tyrus Nazir. One of the volumes that he put out is the Rashi material from the chibur Bris Yaakov. Okay. Now, if you open up Yeshaz Vilna on the side of the Gemara, they say they have this. They say Nuscha is Rabbeinu Yehuda ben Rabbeinu Nassan, the Rivan. Now, you open up the Shar of the Shas Vilna, Maseches Nedarim, they say, when they're highlighting all the different things that they added in that was not in previous Gemaras, which is dozens of different things, over 100 items, they say, Rivan Hashalim Maseches Nazir is, that is what the Pirish on the side of the Gemara is. When you say the Mefarish of Nazir, they're saying is the Rivan, based on their manuscript that they found. And then they said that they found a better manuscript. So those nuschais that are not, so the nuschai that's found on the side of the Gemara is just additions to the Mefarish. So basically, where it's somewhere has something to do with Rashi's Beis Medrash. The Rivan, we know, has a lot to do with the Beis Medrash of Rashi. So that's what the Shas Vilna. Okay, now, for example, the Netziv in Heimek Sheila, he says, and probably it might even have to do with the Shas Vilna that's where his information is from. That he says he's going with that it's the Rivan. Anyway, so this topic has been discussed a lot. A person who devoted a ton of energy and articles and discovering materials about the Ravan was a Yid named Yaakov Nachum Epstein, a professor in Hebrew University, and he has authored a ton of articles in the, maybe it started in the 1920s about the Rivan, his whole Beis Medrash, the Perushe Vermaiza, and he deals with Rashi in Nedarim, and Rashi in Baba Kama, Rashi in Ksuvis, and Rashi also in Nazir. He has over 35 pages dealing with this in great depth. His conclusion is it is not what the Shas Vilna attributes it to be. He does not believe it is the Rivan. So who does he say it is? His conclusion, and obviously, if one wants to read up on it, to read his articles, it's from Pirushe Vermaiza. These are also Perushim that are around the time of Rashi in those areas that has to do with. Aaron Erend, in his doctorate on Rashi, we've quoted him in the past that he's put out some additions on Rashi. He sums up the materials that exist about what the different discussions between Epstein and others about it. Anyway, fast forward to recent years. In 1996, there was a convention about not the Cairo Gniza, but it's called the Italian Gniza. This is discoveries that are found in book bindings of Svarim that are found in all different collections in Europe. Svarim were used to bind books, and they found that they used manuscripts of Svarim. And sometimes, with crazy how they're able to do it, they're able to preserve many times pages and a bunch of pages of different chibur. It's its own long story. We're not going to get into it. So there was a convention in 1996 about it, where they summed up for this convention, maybe before. So one of the people, Professor Simcha Emanuel, who spends a lot of time locating lost works of Rishonim, has been successful in locating them and discussing it in his books and his articles. So he gave a matziv. What's the situation based on all the different discoveries over here? One of the things he says is, luckily we found for the first time Rashi on Nazir 4 blot. Okay, even that's something. And this is in 1996. Okay, now at that time he didn't have proper scans of the Rashis, so that was his conclusion. Fast forward a few years later, he was able to look at it much more carefully. He wrote a more extensive article where he updated his discussion about the discoveries from the Italian Gniza. Anyway, he deals with at length, 6-7 pages, about Rashi on Nazir. His conclusion is most likely it's not Rashi on Nazir. He deals with his conclusions. He talks about it, but his conclusion, he doesn't have a clear conclusion about it. Because of different ways, it's not exactly important to go into the depths how every single thing is done, but they do this through intense learning of understanding the lashonos of these Rishonim and different things that they made up. Anyway, so Tashma says it's a Pirush Magenza. What all these things mean? These are all people or whatever going on in times of Rashi. We're not going to go into it in depth. We're just touching on it. The last thing is as follows. Recently, I come across that Mechon Ofek plans on putting out Rashi on Nazir. I reached out to Rabbi Shoshana, the head of Mechon Ofek. He was kind to send me some of that he claims that he has been able to discover a lot of Rashi on the Masechta, including through a better edition of the Spurs Yaakov that we mentioned that was from 1800 that seemed to have had a manuscript, through other tools of figuring out what Rashi is from Avram and Nahar, and also manuscripts that he hopes in the next few months to actually publish the Rashi on Nazir, and maybe we'll be Zoich in our generation to have the actual Rashi on Nazir. Anyway, that's the story in a nutshell about Rashi on the Masechta.
Okay, it's a chaval that it's not ready by Daf Yami Nazir, but better to do it thoroughly than just to throw it out there in time for Daf Yami. Interesting.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Okay,
let's get to the other Rishonim.
Right, so now the story goes, but pretty much, is there any other Rishonim? So sadly, it takes a very long time for Rishonim to start coming out. In 1774, the Shita Mekubetzes comes out under the name Asifas Akanim, and new editions have been put out, one by this Mechon Harry Fischel and also by Meiser of Cook in recent years. Both are based on the manuscript. But anyway, 1774 is the first time that even if you want to have a Rishon on the Masechta, a real Rishon, that's what there is. Eventually, at one point, they pull out different materials from the Shitim Lebetzes. Anyway, 1795, the Meiri on Maseches Nazir comes out. As we said, Meiri has Rashis. Okay. Fast forward, many years later, 1868, the Taisis Rid is printed for the first time, and in there is some materials on Maseches Nazir. Going back to this person from Mechon Harry Fischel, he reprints the Taisis Rid based on new manuscripts, and he does a better edition with footnotes, everything that's in recent years. Okay. Now, when you open up your Shas Vilna, you see on the side that there's a Rush. So the Rush, it seems, is also a new manuscript that they got for Shas Vilna. That's what they write on the side. And later on, it was discovered Taisis Rush on the Masechta. So basically, as we're moving forward, the Masechta is getting some materials of Rishonim, but not it's not like the standard Masechtas in Nashim Nazikin that has many Rishonim. Okay, fine. Fast forward, in our generation, we have Rav Avigdor Arieli puts out a Sefer Torah Rishonim, and so too the fellow from Harry Fischel puts out collections of Rishonim that are elsewhere about Masechtas Nazir. These, a lot of times people find these Likutim useful. Anyway, okay, that's partially the story of Rishonim. The conclusion of the story of Rishonim starts from, I believe, somewhere in the 1960s. And this is where Moshe Blai, in some episodes I don't have enough time to give him the proper credit, and Amir Tashem, maybe one day it will be good to give him the proper credit to try to tell his story. But Moshe Blai was a person that he published dozens of Rishonim from manuscript from, I'm not sure when he started, but for sure in the 60s they were coming out until he died. There's over something like 40 volumes of materials of his. They deal with halacha, samagada, and a lot of Masechtas and Shas. Masechtas Nazir, what he discovers is a game changer for the Masechta. Number one is he finds Rabbi Avram Nahar, which we already discussed, a drop about it in Masechtas Nedarim, how it made him apecha. And one just looks at the Haskamas, even of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who gave him Haskama, which is interesting in light of the claims that Rav Moshe is not so pro New Rishonim. For example, Rav Moshe writes about the project of Rav Blai, that this helps greatly for the Masechtas, and having these Mefarshim are very, very useful. He says this in, one second, in one of the volumes on Masechtas Nazir, he says, we call Bein be'etzem halimun asher harba sugyas lo muvarin lanu b'avan yasenu medivrei rabbeinu zvarna sugyas ubein beinyane hayra yesh harba inyanim she efshel var halacha brura u'b'safas divrei rabbeinu rishayim efshel yoysul uvar. So it sounds like he holds you could use these mamish for everything. He's writing this in the Bloi Rishayim, and it's been claimed by many that Moshe is not so into new Rishayim. Anyway, Al Kopanim, he puts out Rabbi Avram Nahar, which interestingly enough is from the manuscript of Rabbi Avram Nahar himself. Very unusual to have that the manuscripts that we have are from the actual authors. Usually there's been a long time since that it's not from the author themselves, but this is a case of through author himself. Okay. Anyway, he puts out, besides for putting out Rav Nahar, he puts out Taisus Rabbeinu Peretz, a very nice amount of material, a Rav Turdus, a nice amount of material, material from Chachmei Ivra, and even materials from Shidin Gebetzes that was not published before. So after Rav Moshe Blai's the various discoveries, now finally someone sits down. I don't know in Brisk if they sat down with the Blai Rishayim. I suspect not, but because from what I recall, they're not so into these types of Rishayim. Anyway, the point is, there's plenty what to do. Nazir is in our generation, we're Zeicha, that there's a drastic change. But this is the story of the Rishayim.
Okay, fine. So now you just added a few more years of people learning Masechtas Nazir to their lives. Fine, those are Rishayim. What Achreinim could one use to help them learn Masechtas Nazir?
So Baruch Hashem, it's interesting to see, again, by the time we finish the list, you'll see that today, if someone wants to learn Masechtas Nazir, there's material out there. Starting in, for example, in 1821, a Chibur comes out, Antarus Nazir, but this is interesting, is this author died in 1657. And this author wrote a thorough sefer, but it took a long time for his descendants to publish it. Anyway, he deals with Rashi. He calls it Rashi. So again, we see even after the time of the Beis Yosef, people calling it Rashi. Anyway, fast forward, a chibur comes out called Eirich Meishar. This becomes, in certain places, the go-to sefer on the Masechta. It's published when? In 1723. Today, one could find it in the back of the Shas Vilna. Okay, we see as follows. There's been write-up about him a little bit from Rabbi Levine in one of his volumes published by Meister of Cook, and he even has some interesting information, which we'll quote in a minute. Basically, this Eirich Meishar, which again was done by this Mechon Harry Fischel, he publishes a fancy edition of it. It's very hard to read with footnotes and everything. And we read the Hagdama, you see why he chose to do Masechtas Nazir. One is, we've quoted in the past numerous times, there's a Sefer Hasidim to dafka learn Masechtas that no one learns. So he says, there's no Marsha. There's no Marshal. It's not Halacha L'Maisa. So most people don't learn it. So therefore, and then he plugs in the Sefer Hasidim, which I also said Reb Chaim Kanievsky uses it a lot. and by Moed Katan we discussed the Barichos. So that's why it triggered him to go out of his way to learn this Masechta and write a Pirish. Now, what he noticed is which is what's noticed by many, is the text is very hard. So he tried with early editions that existed at the time of the Gemaras, and trying to read it very carefully to try to figure out the Nusach, and he didn't have manuscripts. But he tried very hard to figure out the text of the Gemara. He was actually, for Parnasa, at certain points, he acted as a Magia for various printing presses. Anyway, he was a Talmud of Reb David Oppenheim, who Reb David Oppenheim, we've mentioned in the past, has a crazy Svarim library. In a letter that this Levine publishes, amongst different things, it's a long letter for that period of time, he writes that maybe you have in your library an old Nusach of the Gemara in manuscript that could help me for my project on Maseches Nazir. Anyway, he also works on the Rambam relating to Nazir, because that's one of the only materials that they had. He didn't have all these Reshaiden that we mentioned that we're Zeicha to have in our generation. Anyway, he's very involved. He's famous for working on the Darkei Moshe. He publishes the Darkei Moshe on Yeridea from manuscript, the first person. Interestingly enough, the Darkei Moshe, which is the key way to understand the Ramah, was not published by the Ramah in his lifetime. It wasn't published by Talmidim. For many, many years, it was not available. Until recent years, only Choshen Mishpat came out, which is a funny thing when you think about the fundamental Achron of ours, the Sefer to explain himself, where he at least gives you some idea of where he's coming from, was not published. So at least in Yeridea, it took time, but this fellow, he was the person behind publishing it. This led to fights with Rabbi Yaakov Reisher. Anyway, Akopanim, this is the Sefer, and it's found today in the back of a Shas Vilna. And as I said, Harry Fischel put out a beautiful edition of the Sefer. Now, if you go further on, again, this year 1821 comes up. There's a Sefer Shalmei Nazir was another fellow trying to get a hold of old manuscript. He also tried to get old editions of the Gemara. Again, we see struggling for the text of the Gemara. At one point, this person writes that the Lashon Ani, which we've mentioned in the past, is Rashi Tevis of the hard Masechtas. He says Ani, the Nun is referring to not Nida, but it's referring to Nazir. Anyway, okay, fast forward, again, in the same period of time, in the 1820s, Rabbi Tzal Ranjberger from Prague, we're not going to get into his whole interesting story, but he puts out, a family member of his puts out the Maisa Rav. Today, if you open up Yeshas Vilna, they have it on this side, on this Masechta. He's using heavily the Eirich Meishar. He also doesn't have manuscripts. Anyway, we move on to a little further. So the question is, did they ever learn it in yeshivas? Interestingly enough, we go to the father of all yeshivas Volozhin. So yes, we have an account of in 1826 them learning Maseches Nazir, the Sefer Minchas Yehuda, a very interesting sefer on the Masech on Gan Shas from Yudel Halevi Epstein, a Talmud of Volozhin. Also learned Shas Chavrusa with the Nachos David, which is a tremendous chus. Anyway, he learned by Rabbi Yitzchak Volozhin. He says, in the first piece he has on Nazir, he says, Rabbi Yitzchak Volozhin said over, and he gives the date, and he says, use the Aruch Meishar. So we have it being learned in Volozhin. Interestingly enough, one of the main go-to achreinim on the Masechta is called Birchas Rosh. This sefer is published, he's born in 1797, he dies in 1866. Okay, who is this person? This is Reb Asher. I think it's Reb Asher HaKohen, his name was. Now, what's interesting about this person is he's a Talmud Muvak of by none other than Reb Chaim Volozhiner. And such a Talmud, he ends up at the age of 18, he's in Volozhin for 3-4 years, and he ends up giving shir in Reb Chaim Volozhiner's time for 3 years in Volozhin. It's not a known fact, but the son writes this in the various Hagdamas of the Svarim of his fathers, that the father published on Brachas and on Masechtas Nazir. Again, a concern is to focus on the Nuschais. In 1876 is a later edition of the Sefer, and this author, this Birchas Rosh, is very famous for a different Sefer. People don't know that he's the author of it, but the famous Keser Rosh, Archas Chaim, which is many of the Anhagas and questions that people, Talmidim, ask, discuss with Reb Chaim Volozhiner. There's material about the Gra, interesting stuff with Reb Chaim Volozhiner, which recently, it's a very famous Sefer. There's been many editions of the Sefer. Recently, someone put it out with a catchy title called Sichos Reb Chaim Volozhin in Talmidei HaYeshiva, which is a catchy title, but it has... There's many manuscripts of this. It's its own story. Anyway, B'chon Shleim also put out an edition of it recently. Anyway, this is one of the more thorough svarim on the Masechta from a Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. Okay, we move on. There's a sefer Leket HaKaitzrim. Leket HaKaitzrim is from Reb Pinchas Michal. Who is this Reb Pinchas Michal? Turns out It's published in 1866, literally a few years after the Birchas Rosh. Turns out, who is he? He's a Talmud Muvak by this. He's in the same city as this Reb Asher, and he puts it out. He gets a skama from his Rebbe, from the Baal Birchas Rosh. He says, yeah, I know you're using my sefer. He says he's not hiding anything over here. And basically he was making, I guess he was trying to make an easier version or something for people. But okay. Now, just to throw out there, as we like to throw out sometimes tidbits, who is this Reb Pinchas Michal? He becomes a Litvisher Rav. He writes on some other Maseches and Kachim, and drushes of his survived, drushes that he gave in his Kehilas from the 1860s to the 1880s. In 1959, my great uncle, Rabbi Abba Zions, published them. He was a great grandson somehow from this Pinchas Michal, and he printed these drushes. They're available on Hebrew books. Now, what's interesting is a story attributed with this. In general, in the Litvisher world, they're not very fond of saying over Meifsim stories, but in this book from Rabbi Zions, he brings down a known story that was with the famous Martchas Lanimer, also another great Litvisher Gadol, who was actually known as a Baal Meifis. In the Litvisher world, which is unique, they say the Chafetz Chaim used to send people to him for when people had issues, different issues, and he was a known Baal Meifis now, but he's also a tremendous Talmud Chacham, and he put out not recently, already, it's been a very long time, Mechon Mishnah Sarbaran put out a volume of his called Hadras Mordechai Al Torah and Bereshis. Supposedly, very soon, Shemais is finally supposed to be coming out, according to different write-ups about Mishnah Sarbaran and recent publications that I've seen. Hopefully that's true. Now, what's the story? In brief, the story is that this Ramartchas Lanimer had a dream, and basically there was a sefer at the time. There was a sefer way back. Mari Ben Lev, it seems the Mari Ben Lev paskin the Shaila, and someone that he paskin the Shaila to didn't like his answer. It was a Din Torah, and he slaps this Mari Ben Lev in the face. And it was a known story. It's brought down in history books from way back in the Karya Dairs. Fast forward, Ramartchas Lanimer has a dream, and it turns out that basically the descendant, something to do with the descendant, needs a tikkun. It could be Ramartchas Lanimer is a descendant somehow of this person who slapped the Mari Ben Lev. The Mari Ben Lev is coming to him in the dream and says, you have to learn my svarim as a tikkun. I don't have the svarim, says Ramartchas Lanimer. He goes, yes, but there's a yid that does have it, Reb Pinchas Michal. Now, Reb Pinchas Michal happened to be a good friend of the Ramartchas Lanimer. Buy it from him, and that will help him be able to publish his works later on Kachim, because he's not able to publish his works on Kachim. He's lacking money. So you'll be buying the Mari Ben Lev. This will help as a tikkun. You're going to learn the Mari Ben Lev for 4 years. You have to learn my svarim as a tikkun for your descendant, for that he slapped me in the face. This is going hundreds of years that something's happening to this neshama. Anyway, this is what's significant over here is many people like to say Chasidisha Meifsim. This is a Litvisha Meifis. Okay. Anyway, returning back to our regular episode is the Keren Oira, as you mentioned, that you learned this. It's 1868. It's published. Again, we've spoken in the past. Is he directly a Talmud Rechaim Volozhin or not? But it's Kedarkai very Be'iyun, deals with Yerushalmi, the Tosefta, the Shitim Gobetzes, and he calls the Parish Rashi. Going back to Volozhin, the Netziv, on Maseches Nazir, we have a lot, basically the whole Masechta. He uses a ton the Meiri, which will go back to the episodes on Reb Chaim Kanievsky using the Rishonim. He calls it the Mefarish. Okay. Now, fast forward to 1966, a discovery is made. How this discovery was made will be an interesting story. I'm not sure what how they discovered, but they discovered in Hebrew University a manuscript of the Rameir Simcha with a lot of material, and a lot of material on Nazir is published in Chedusha Rameir Simcha on Shas. Okay, Kedarkai, this has a lot of material relating to the Yerushalmi. He also brings Meiri and deals a lot with the Rambam. So again, we have another person using the Rishonim, especially the Meiri. Fine. Now, in the 1930s, Rav Hutner puts out a sefer called Teiros HaNazir, and it has Haskamas. And the Haskamas, to quote the Haskamas, one Haskama he gets is from Rav Hutner. And if one goes to buy the standard Teiros HaNazir that's, I think, available today, Rav Hutner, it's from Reb Chaim Eliezer. He has this Haskama from Reb Chaim Eliezer, impressive Haskama. Okay, then he also has, on the next page, 2 Haskamas. One is from Rav Kook, and the other one is from the Dvar Avram. However, in later editions, it seemed to have been removed. Why? One will have to ask various Chaim Berliners to have the backstory of why that is so. What happened? Was there anything that happened that made him remove these two eskamas? Because of this censorship, it has become now found many times in auction houses. It sells for a few $100s because it's the original chibur had other eskamas and they're taken out. Anyway, fast forward back to this Harry Fischel Machon. So they also published, this fellow publishes Rabbi Akiva Eiger, he publishes Reb Shlomo Eiger. At some point they find this Sfas Emes after the war on this Masechta. Also, I'll just mention there's a Chibur Nazir Avram from a fellow Rabbi Avram Krohn, someone that I knew from in a past lifetime. I think he might be in Waterbury. He has a very thorough sefer on the Masechta. I saw it on Hebrew Books. In it, it has Torah for those that learned in the Mir from Rabbi Asher Areli even, and that is just to show you that I could once in a while mention a more contemporary sefer. Okay, now just to end off with the following few brief points, and that's it. Number one, what about halacha l'maisa? Is this Masechta halacha l'maisa? Are there svarim halacha l'maisa Masechtas Nazir? And why isn't it really brought in Shulchan Aruch? Now, interestingly enough, looking about this, I reminded myself that the Magen Avram already in Siman Aleph, Sif Katan Yud Aleph, has a discussion relating to Masechtas Nazir, it turns out, with Rabbi Yitzchak Mipozna, possibly his Rebbe. It's even dated, it's taking place in Taf Chaf Ches. Anyway, the Shach has a discussion about why these halachas, why there's no discussion really in Shulchan Aruch, and he talks about, he has a nice piece, Kedarka B'Kodesh, and Siman Reish Lamed Tes, Sif Katan Chaf Ches in Yardea. He ends off with the following statement. V'ayin b'tshuvas achronim kama tshuvas b'dinei neziros and neziros shimshon, which sounds like that what? There was some tshuvas, it came up for real. Now, fast forward, you look on the same page, you'll see the Piskei Tshuva Sifkat and Vav. He brings the Shach is Makatzer over here. He doesn't tell you which Achrayim, but the Piskei Tshuva brings you a nice list. Now, then the Piskei Tshuva throws out the famous thing that everyone knows when you're handling Antarus Nadarim Erev Rosh Hashanah, the Nusach, if you say Nazir Shimshon, you don't say Nazir Shimshon, what's in a gay? If it's not, okay, he throws it out over there also. Anyway, interestingly enough, there's a Chibur Erech Lechem, which is a Ben Daira of the Ramah, similar type of work as the Ramah, a composition halacha l'maisa, and it's first printed in these simanim are first printed early on, in the early 1700s, in the Chuvas Hilchos Ketanis by Rav Moshe Chagiz when he publishes his father's work. Anyway, over there, at Seif Siman Reish Lamed Tes, he has a arichos nifla of a sikum of Hilchos Nazir. He also has a big arichos about Nazir Shimshon, being malakit from many Chuvas Svarim about Nazir Shimshon. L'maisa, there's been many discoveries about Nazir Shimshon, new tshuvas. Even in the past few months, I've gotten some svarim from Tkufas of the Beis Yosef with new tshuvas about the sugya. It seems it was very common in that period of time to have shilas about Nazir Shimshon. If someone, it could be, I don't know, I can't promise, but maybe we might do an episode specifically with the historical aspects of all the different tshuvas about it and what's going on as it plays out with Masechtas Nazir, with Nazir Shimshon. But being that we're having great difficulty lately of finding sponsors for such an episode, I can't promise such a thing. So I'm only saying bli neder about it. Especially we're still learning Nadarim. Now, fast forward, Aruch HaShulchan HaAsid writes a chibur, which we are zeicha to have, especially heavily devoted based on the Rambam and Yerushalmi. Okay, now, but is there anything more? And the answer is, of course, there always is, and that is, there's a chibur called Nazir Elohim, put out by Mechon HaMikdash, Rabbi Shua Friedman. It's the title on the front page. It says Mitzvahs HaNaziris Bizman Hazeh Halacha L'Maisa, and here we have a few hundred pages, almost 350 pages devoted to the sugya of Nazir and Halacha L'Maisa. And then also Baruch Hashem, Torah, Baruch Hashem, people always looking for new ways to write. We discussed about the Mishnah Berurah phenomena of writing Svarim in the format of the Mishnah Berurah / Derech Emunah. We have a beautiful sefer called Piskei Nazir from someone in Bnei Brak, almost 400 pages. He does specify already in the front that it's not halacha l'maisa, but it looks like a fascinating sefer on Masechtas Nazir. Halachadik, the top is the Rambam. He has a similar Mishnah Berurah Bir Halacha type style with the Sha'ar Tzion, just to mention him, it's called Piskei Nazir. And then to be Messiah, we always have to throw out this, just as any academic material. So there is one is this Professor Daniel Boyarin put out a critical edition of the first few parakim of Nazir based on the manuscripts. And also there's a Yid who was nifter, sadly, he was sick, Aaron Shemesh from Bar Ilan University, put out a small academic book on Nazir, all about it in historical aspects. To be Messiah, were there any people in history that Lamaisa took on some level of being a Nazir in any form? So one of the people that always fascinated me for personal reasons, because my grandfather was a Talmud of his, was the Ragachover. I remember coming across one time when I was in high school, the Pardes Yosef from Rabbi Mandelbaum had come out on Bamidbar. He was working on completing the original Pardes Yosef, which was on Bereishis, Shemais, and Vayikra. And over there, he brings down a story. It seems the Ragachover was affiliated with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Lubavitch Hasidus. Lubavitchers are very fond of mentioning this, and they have a few books about it. Anyway, the point is that it seems that he told him, make sure to learn Nazir, and the Ragachover supposedly took that to mean, what does it mean to learn Nazir? Why is it different than anything else? That maybe he wants him to be a Nazir, and it's Yadua, and the rare pictures, today it's not as rare, but those that collected Gedolim pictures in the time, back in the day, Gedolim pictures of the Ragachover were considered rare. You always see his hair all over the place. So the claim was it's because of the Nazir. In recent years, there's been discussions about it. It seems it's not true. He did cut his hair, maybe not often. Maybe it had to do with Bittul Torah. There's a small booklet called Mitayrasa Shel Tzafnas Paneach from someone who's, I would call him one of the many Ragachover junkies from Modin Elite, and he has a whole discussion about it where his conclusion is that it's nothing to do with being a Nazir. To conclude, because one of the Gedolei Talmidim of Rav Kook was Rav David HaNazir, which I believe the Oldaf is Amir Tzashem sponsoring a special episode about the Nazir, the history of it. You could see it on they'll be sending out the links about it soon, Amir Tzashem. Anyway, Rav David HaNazir, so in his who's a Talmud Muvak by Rav Kook, involved with putting out his materials, also a fascinating, interesting person, as you'll find out if you listen to that episode. But the point is, in his autobiography, which is incredible to read, he was a Nazir. And he was a Nazir of some sort. I guess it requires explanation what type of Nazir. Just to end with this statement that he says, Amali loibasi el b'shvil zeh, lefarsim shem zeh, liyos b'levavai zera kodesh Yisrael, tziriyat zayin, zechroinus kodshei avuram hagala b'gilui shchina, taharu kadosh lahakas b'livam harach, Gale gaguim lavid zeh sheyukum v'yila asid chidush yamenu kekeden gam b'shvil zeh kedai lasei seluzbol ve'emloid ravli rav. The way he begins this piece is Nazir hineni shem zeh hineni noisi bahadri kodesh. Anyway, this is a passage that it's in his fascinating autobiography, which sadly we don't have the whole thing. We only have parts of it. The son didn't, I guess, want the whole thing to come out. Anyway, that's the story in short of Nazir. So one could see that today, Baruch Hashem, in 2023, Daf Yomi, someone learning Nazir, or if you're not learning Daf Yomi, there's a tons of material to learn this Masechta. Spend many years getting stuck down the rabbit holes of this Masechta.
Okay, thank you very much. Another fascinating episode on Sifrei HaMasechta. We are looking forward to hearing other episodes on other topics. Once again, if you have any interest in a topic, please reach out. Sponsorships are always welcome and available. We take the money in any currency, dollars, shkalim, any type. Anyway, thank you very much, Rabbi Brodt. Have a wonderful day.